So welcome everyone to Office Hours. I called Office Hours today, and I'm leaving it open to everyone. So this is not. I usually have Office Hours exclusively for subscribers to my newsletter, Tomato Slice, but this was a pressing issue, and I felt like a lot of people would benefit from hearing me talk about it because I know that a lot of people have questions about these two articles that came out last week. So I just wanted to open up the forum and have a discussion about them today and answer any questions that I'm sure you guys have about the articles. And if you're curious what articles I'm talking about, if you go over to Summer Tomato, there are two articles that I linked to in this post that describe two phenomenon. One is the possibility of sugar being toxic, not just fattening, but toxic. And the other is sort of the latest scientific consensus on the role of dietary fat, and specifically saturated fat, in cardiovascular disease. So these are the two things I want to talk about. If you have anything specifically you'd like for me to explain during the show, go ahead and ask at any time. This is not going to be as formal as a typical Summer Tomato Live show. Interrupt me whenever. You can ask questions in the chat, but I'm more likely to see them if you ask questions using the little Ask a Question button. And if you want to chat and actually have a physical video chat, feel free to call in with video, and I would be happy to chat with you. Just make sure you have headphones in when you call. Otherwise, there's a lot of feedback and it's really bad. So I'm making sure we have a screener here. So somebody will help you with that if you want to call in. Great. So here, there's all sorts of stuff going on. Okay. So I hope you guys had a chance to read Gary Taubes' piece in the New York Times Magazine that came out last week titled, "Is Sugar Toxic?" It was pretty amazing. This is the first I've heard anyone, let alone besides Dr. Lustig, who he talked about extensively in the article. This is the first time I've seen the New York Times or anything like that, or even Taubes himself, make such a vital distinction between sugar and all the other carbohydrates, right? And I think this is really important. This is something I've been saying for a long time, and it's the point I always disagree with the sort of low-carb camp about, and that's that there's a huge difference between rice and sugar. Specifically, he talks about sucrose, which is table sugar, and high fructose corn syrup, which we all love to hate. This is the stuff that soda is made out of and everything else. So I'm curious what you guys thought. I'd love to know what your impression was of the article, because the word toxic is very powerful. It's a very powerful word. It means that sugar is not just something you shouldn't have. It means it could potentially be giving you cancer, heart disease, a lot of much more serious afflictions than just simply extra empty calories or whatever that may be. Because empty calories, presumably, you could work off at the gym, right? But you can't work off arsenic at the gym. So that's sort of what the discussion that Taubes brought up, and I think that it's a very important one to have. And so just to give you guys a little bit of background, in case you didn't read the article or in case maybe you misunderstood something in the article, he talks specifically about the role of fructose. So fructose, if you don't know your sugar biochemistry, which you probably don't, I wouldn't expect you to. Fructose is a type of sugar molecule, and there are several different kinds of sugar molecules. And some sugar molecules can be made from smaller sugar particles, so molecules. So sucrose, as he explains in the article, is a mixture of one glucose molecule and one fructose molecule. And fructose is the sugar that's typically found in fruit, so it's naturally occurring. And humans have been eating it for millions of years. But the issue that he brings up in the article is whether or not the high doses that we're eating now and the rate at which we ingest it, because it's not easy to guzzle down like 40 apples, right? Which is what it would take to equal, some like a dessert or something like that. So the issue is more about dosage and the speed at which we ingest the fructose. And he also talks about the difference between sucrose, which I said is one glucose molecule and one fructose molecule, which as soon as it hits your stomach, by the way, it's broken into glucose and fructose. So the glucose molecule goes and is absorbed by your bloodstream. The fructose molecule goes to your liver and is processed there. And as Lustig describes in the video, which if you guys haven't watched the video that Taubes refers to in the article, you should. It's really good. And if you are at all interested in the biochemistry of fructose metabolism and all that, it's incredibly informative. But basically what he says is that when you eat sucrose, it's pretty much the same as eating high fructose corn syrup, because high fructose corn syrup was basically designed to be almost the same as sucrose. Fructose has high fructose corn syrup. It's slightly more fructose, so it's 55% of the calories, whereas 55% of the composition of high fructose corn syrup is fructose. The other 45% is glucose, whereas in a sucrose molecule, it's exactly 50-50 because there's one of each. So the question then, so this is the first time I've really heard Taubes like letting glucose off the hook. I mean, in Why We Get Fat and Good Calories, Bad Calories, I mean, he acts like any carb that goes into your bloodstream and increases blood sugar and increases insulin is going to be really dangerous for you and going to make you fat and going to cause diabetes and all that. And he makes a very compelling case for that. But in this article, he seems to take a much different approach, which is that regardless of the glucose, the fructose itself going to the liver is the real problem. And this is an entirely different way of thinking about it, and it really brings home the point that sugar may be uniquely different and uniquely dangerous in our diets, which was kind of cool because that sort of, to some extent, lets off the hook a lot of the other carbohydrates, which I never thought should be on the hook anyway. I always thought starch and sugar should be in separate categories. Not that you can eat unlimited amounts of starch and not expect to get fat or whatever. But fructose is different because it's processed different by your body. Your body recognizes it as a different compound. So the biggest question that I sort of kept getting from Twitter and in the comments and stuff when I posted this article is, okay, well, fructose is a natural molecule, and how can you tell me that this is bad for us? We've been eating it for millions of years. This is just like, the sugar reactionaries are being, they're just using scare tactics to get us to stop eating something, and, we'll figure out in a couple of years that none of this is important. That's a good argument, and that's a good point, and that's why Taubes goes into this for a long time in the article, actually. He talks about, well, what is the dose? What is the dose that's dangerous? I've never seen a study in the history of the universe saying that fruit is dangerous. I've never seen anything saying that fruit causes cancer, if anything, the opposite, right? Like fruit and vegetables prevent against cancer. So that's a good point. And Taubes, sort of throws his hands up and says, we don't know the answer to this. So that makes it really hard to decide what to do, right? But there's a couple other points in the article that I think are worth noting. And one is that he said that the early recommendations that were made in 1986 about whether or not the added sugars, and these are specifically added sugars, so if you're not counting fruit, but sugars that are added to fruit such as sucrose, added to other fruits such as sucrose or high fructose corn syrup, what impact are those going to have? Oh, hi Toaster, little puppy. What impact are those going to have on us? And the original study said that in 1986 that 40 pounds, there was no evidence that it was bad. But Taubes pointed out that they were actually consuming around 75 pounds of added sugar per year when that was written, and now we're up to 90 pounds. And to think about how massive, how much sugar that is. It's an incredible amount of sugar. So there's a big difference here between fruit sugar and the overdose we're clearly consuming now, and it's unclear where the line is. So that's a hard decision to make. And then then he goes on to say, and even in small amounts, it could acutely fuel cancer, which is also possible. But again, I find it highly unlikely that it's at the very low doses that are found naturally in fruits and vegetables. Right, so someone pointed out in the chat room that Lustig points out in his video that fructose in nature is almost always found with fiber, which will slow down the digestion, which is an important point. So the rate at which you consume fructose is a big issue. And that includes the rate at which you just chew and swallow. Right, I think that, fiber and protein and fat and all that slow digestion, and that's good, but you can always also control it yourself mechanically with how slow you chew and swallow and all that. So I think this is a really important discussion to finally be having, and I think it's really fascinating. And because, the question is, well, who wants to go their whole life without dessert, right? I mean, is that really what we're facing? It seems like that's what Taubes does, and it sounds like that's what some of the cancer researchers do. But, I was talking to someone the other day, and, I thought about it a little bit, and I was like, is there really somebody who lived to be 100 years old? Let's say there's been, populations of people that live to be really old, and I find it highly unlikely that a single one of them managed to live on this earth 100 years without having any dessert. I just think that's really unlikely. Maybe it's true. Yeah, so someone points out that it takes a lot longer to chew an apple than a cupcake. That's right. But is one cupcake going to give you cancer? Right? So, of course not. I feel like that's really the question we're dealing with is what frequency, what dosage, what specific other properties do the food have? Is it going to, where is that line? And I think it's really hard to say. It could depend on a lot of things. And definitely the science, we don't have an answer right now. So it could depend on your genetics. So some people might just be more sensitive to sugar. It could depend on what else is in your diet. So, there's some evidence that vegetables are protective against cancer. So maybe if you eat one cupcake, but the rest of the time you eat vegetables, you're better. Maybe fiber or soluble fiber, specifically your polyunsaturated fats, like the omega-3 fatty acids and fish oil and all that good stuff. Maybe that stuff can prevent this. We don't really know any of these answers yet. So I guess my take-home message for all of you is to understand that we don't have answers right now to these questions. But we do have a lot of hints that sugar is really dangerous, particularly in large quantities. So, and we also have evidence that the more processed and unnatural the sugar is, the more likely it is to be dangerous because it is so easy to ingest more of it. And so my take-home advice to all of you is, to just be careful with this stuff. Understand that to some extent you're playing with fire, and while fire can be very useful and very tasty, it can also get you into trouble. So be careful with the sugar. Let me see if I had a few other notes on this. Make sure I'm getting that. One other thing I wanted to point out is that agave. So if Lustig's hypothesis is correct, and if Taubes is right, and if fructose is uniquely bad, so agave nectar can tend to be anywhere from. Agave nectar can be, so it's marketed as not sugar and a low GI food, which, that reminds me of something I'll talk about in a second. But, agave, the reason it's low glycemic index, fructose is low glycemic, and the reason agave has a lot of fructose, and that's why it's low glycemic. So it can be, so the agave, depending on the production, is all over the place in terms of its fructose quantity, and it tends to be either around the same as high fructose corn syrup or have much higher fructose, up to 90% of its sugar is fructose. So potentially, agave is always marketed as this alternative sugar health food. It could potentially be a hell of a lot more dangerous than high fructose corn syrup, if this hypothesis is right. So just keep that in mind. Keep that in mind whenever you see natural crap being marketed as good for you. I actually, I got really frustrated last weekend because I was over at this wonderful grocery store we have in San Francisco called Rainbow Grocery. I love it. It's like this ultimate like co-op health food store. It's like Whole Foods on like hippie steroids or something. It's super wonderful. But I went to go try to find. I'm always looking for like new granolas, and specifically I was out of muesli, and they don't carry my normal brand Dorset, which I normally get at Whole Foods. So I was looking for an alternative muesli. I couldn't find any muesli, first of all, which was annoying because that's the only thing that's really usually sugar free. And then I started grabbing different bags and like looking at the ingredients, and I couldn't believe how many of them said no sugar on the outside, but then when you look at the label, it had maple syrup, or it had agave, or it had honey. How is that not sugar? I just think that should be illegal. So be very careful when you're reading packages. And another thing that annoyed me is that the first ingredient on like probably 5 of the 6 granola packages I picked up was love, made with love. Like, come on, guys. I mean, I understand it's like a warm, like, it's supposed to be a warm hippie brand, whatever, but that's just misleading because the second ingredient is oats and then the third ingredient is syrup. So anyway, that annoyed me, and I implore you to be careful when you're at health food stores pretending that they have sugar substitutes that are somehow better for you than sugar. Sugar's bad for you. Sugar substitutes are bad for you, and I wouldn't trust any of them. And so the best thing is to get your sugar from fruit and to wean yourself off these things and, reacclimate to natural flavors. It's not bad, actually. It's great because once you do that, your taste for all those like super sweet like Easter candies totally goes away, which is great. So you're not even tempted anymore. Awesome. Do you guys have any questions so far, either in chat or whatever? So I think it's really interesting. So it's interesting the way Taubes has shifted in this article from. So he still seems to think that insulin resistance is important. So those of you who read Why We Get Fat, and I wrote a review of it on Summer Tomato, you can search for it there. But he talks about, in that book, he talks about how high blood sugar and high insulin are what cause obesity, diabetes, and heart disease, which he basically lumps all in the same category. He thinks they're all the same, even though they're dissociable in several studies, but whatever. I mean, he makes a good point. For most Americans, they are the same. But this is the first time he's ever said insulin resistance doesn't come from you eating too much glucose and your blood glucose going up and your body producing more insulin. Instead, he says your liver produces fat when you digest fructose, and that fat in your liver is what causes insulin resistance. So that's a totally new mechanism, a totally new model coming out of this paper, which I think is really interesting too. So, I imagine, and it's nice to see him sort of finding this nuance because I imagine both are important. But, he's always been a very black and white sort of writer, like this is fact and this is lies. And, it's nice to see him sort of realizing that there's more involved here than just, the simple explanation that eating sugar spikes blood sugar spike creates insulin, and then somehow your cells just get tired of it and your pancreas poops out. I think it's more complicated than that. And fat in the liver from fructose might be a big key that we've been, a big key to the equation that we've been missing. So I think that's my take on that. What else is interesting over here? Oh, so we should talk a little bit more about how good the data is that sugar causes cancer, because that's like a pretty hardcore thing to claim, right? I mean, cancer is hardcore, and I think most of us grew up thinking it's just something you randomly get, and maybe it's genetics, but maybe not, and you just sort of hope it's not you. But there's actually a good amount of data that traditional societies who didn't, before like the Western modern diet came around, like hardly had any cancer. They didn't really know about it. And not until modern foods were introduced did it become very common and very rampant, particularly certain kinds of cancer. So gastrointestinal tract, so stomach, esophagus, colon, colorectal, all those different things, liver cancer, pancreatic cancer. Pancreas is the cell or the organ that secretes insulin. And then also hormonal cancers have become much more common, such as breast cancer, ovarian cancer, cervical cancer, prostate cancer. So it's unlikely that all of that new cancer is accidental. It's very likely to be dependent on the environment, and there's actually a good amount of data that it's tied very closely anyway to diet, and specifically Western diet, and specifically the introduction of sugar and maybe flour. But, and he's arguing here that it's actually the sugar that is the cause, and I personally kind of believe that. He says that cancer is associated with obesity, which is also associated with diet, as well as insulin production, and which feeds tumor growth. So, I don't know. It's not something I would ignore, and I don't think we're being sort of scare tactic sort of people by saying that you should be worried about sugar possibly playing a role in cancer. But again, it all comes down to sort of the question of how much and at what dose. Because cancer isn't something that sort of, like, there's a trigger that happens. It makes a cell turn from a regular cell into a cancer cell. And then there's another trigger that happens that turns that cancer cell into a growing, dividing, malignant cancer. And so the question is what causes and creates those stop points, and what's the safe amount before you get to the first one. So it's crazy, and I'm really glad that we're finally having this discussion in a public forum like the New York Times. The article made a big splash. I saw a lot of people that I assumed would never care about health food or anything tweeting about how scary the study was to them, and I think that's important that people understand what they're risking by eating a lot of sugar. Great. So let's talk also about the other paper. So the other paper that I linked to, it's a little sciencey, geeky, but I hope that you guys like that part of me deep down. But I thought it was really fascinating that this came out the way it did. And basically what this paper did was, it's not really a paper, it's not research, it's not a finding. But basically what happened was 30 or so of the most respected, most prominent people in the field of nutrition and health got together to talk about what evidence there is that saturated fat causes heart disease, which is something I think almost everyone I talk to who doesn't, move in these health food circles, everyone assumes that saturated fat causes heart disease. I mean, it's sort of like, it's like people look at you like you're insane if you say that might not be the whole truth. And so, but one of the problems is that the data is confusing because there's a lot of conflict of interest in nutrition. Obviously, the meat associations and the Dairy Council and all these people have a lot of money, and the data, sadly, and the science can get tainted with that. And so you have conflicting studies, and you have to be very careful about who you believe and this and that. So that's why these scientists got together and were like, well, let's go take a good, hard look at the data on saturated fat and what causes heart disease. And what could be more interesting than that if you're me? Because I have been skeptical about the role of saturated fat in heart disease for a long time, and for a lot of reasons. And when I first started reading about nutrition, I assumed, like everybody else does, that it's just sort of true that saturated fat's bad for you. And part of the reason that we all assume that is because a lot of the studies support that hypothesis. And the reason but when you're a scientist, it has to be more than supporting a hypothesis that makes something conclusive, right? Because there can be confounding factors, outside influences that make it seem like that's the reason, but it's really something else. And also, you just sort of, it's easy to see what you expect to see. And I think that very good scientists can fall victim to this quite a bit. That, if everyone says that saturated fat's bad and your data, may or may not support that, you're going to not emphasize it if it doesn't. You'll be like, oh, this was confusing. But that won't be the headline. It won't be the saturated fat hypothesis is wrong. The headline will be like, well, we probably just didn't have, or the headline will be something else in their study, and then in the discussion they'll be like, oh, we probably just didn't have the statistical power to show that finding, but we all assume that, of course, saturated fat's bad for you. And I see that all the time in these studies. And so I was skeptical, and so they finally got together and evaluated the evidence, and they saw a lot of interesting things. One of the reasons that people do assume that saturated fat is bad is because there's been several studies where when you replace some percentage of saturated fat in the diet with what they call polyunsaturated fats, and those are going to be your omega-3 fatty acids, your omega-6 fatty acids. These are your essential fatty acids. That there is like a slight improvement in cardiovascular risks, and not just not just markers like cholesterol and stuff, but even like mortality and cardiovascular events like a stroke or a heart attack. So that for a lot of people would, for a long time, and myself included, would point to that and be like, see, reducing saturated fat is healthy. or prevents heart attacks, whatever. Like, that's pretty hardcore. But the problem is that if you start replacing saturated fat, I'm talking here about percentage of calories, if you start replacing saturated fat with other things, like, say, carbohydrates, guess what happens to your risk of heart disease? Either nothing or it goes up. And that's not good. And that argues strongly that reducing saturated fat isn't good, right? I mean, I'm not saying that, basically, you can't say anything about saturated fat. You can say, but from either of those studies, you can either say something about saturated fat in relation to polyunsaturated fat, or you can say something about saturated fat in relation to carbohydrate. However, when you start putting these studies together, you realize that there are a lot of things. So you realize that sometimes reducing saturated fat helps, and sometimes it doesn't. And what you have to start asking, if you're thinking critically, then, is if sometimes it doesn't help to reduce saturated fat, maybe it's not the saturated fat. Maybe it's the other studies where they had improvement because they were adding back the polyunsaturated fats. Maybe that's the reason. And, sorting all this stuff out is really difficult. So the researchers did concur that replacing some saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat does seem to be beneficial. However, replacing some saturated fat with monounsaturated fat, which is olive oil, avocado, some nuts, generally what I would consider healthy fats, they couldn't get enough conclusive evidence to say that this would help with heart disease. They said that maybe it would be, it's because they just didn't have enough statistical power. Maybe they did, which is what they always say, But, they also showed that replacing saturated fat with carbohydrate didn't help. So to me, it just seems like reducing saturated fat alone as like an end point is not necessarily a benefit. And it's great to see, the world's premier scientists, including Dr. Walter Willett, who's, the head of nutrition at Harvard, and, he wrote my favorite nutrition book, which I'll show you guys. I don't know where it went. Oh, and my microphone's sitting on it. But, they're coming out and saying that this isn't conclusive and we need more work. And right now we don't have enough evidence to say that reducing saturated fat reduces heart disease. How interesting is that? However, there are important caveats to this. One, processed meats do seem to be pretty bad. So I wrote about deli meat today for my post at Summer Tomato, and processed meats, smoked, and that includes smoked meat, things like that, your bacons, your hams, your sausages, and even your deli meats, probably not good in the heart disease department. Although even that data is sort of all over the place. And I tried to find data that it causes cancer, and sometimes it does. It was slightly associated, sometimes not. The data wasn't. It's so always so confusing. But in terms of just heart disease, they recommend keeping that minimum as far as processed meats go. They also were careful to say that more studies need to be done dissociating the impact of carbohydrates, because most of the studies, they just sort of lump all carbohydrates together, which as we sort of discussed in the last half hour, we're just discovering that not all carbohydrates are created equal, and it seems that the less processed they are, the healthier they are, and the more benefits they give you. So it's not clear at this point if maybe replacing some saturated fat with certain kinds of carbohydrates, and I would say that they would say intact grains, maybe some kind of whole grain breads might not be bad, but might actually be good. But certainly not refined carbohydrates. Refined carbohydrates, like I've never seen any more agreement in any community in the nutrition community than that refined carbohydrates are bad for you. Like this is like not like the low fat people, like everybody says it. Even like vegans say it. I mean, it's like the data is just overwhelming. Nobody could argue that refined carbohydrates are not really, really bad for you. So I think that's really interesting. Do you guys have any thoughts on this? Did anybody read the paper? And do you have any questions or insights? Like I find it not conclusive, but I just find the saturated fat argument to be really shaky. Does anybody want to talk about this at all? Virginia, what do you think? I mean, it's hard because we've been told for so long that it's bad, right? The saturated fat will kill you. Clogs arteries, raises cholesterol. But, they talk a little bit in the paper about the value of using cholesterol as an endpoint or as a marker. And they actually, I love this about the paper. I'm glad I remembered this. They make a serious point to say that there's no like one thing you can look at in someone's blood panel or anything else that says, yes, this person has a like almost 100% or a very good risk of heart disease. It's like you always have to look at the totality of the evidence. And LDL cholesterol, the bad cholesterol, does often correspond with other risk factors for heart disease, such as high triglycerides, which is really bad, as well as low HDL cholesterol. But that's common in the Western diet. That's a typical, so anybody eating a typical standard American diet, the SAD diet, Western diet, is almost always going to have that lipid panel. They're going to be high LDL, low HDL, really low, scary low HDL, and high triglycerides. And that's a result of the diet as a whole. So that's a diet that includes a lot of refined carbohydrates, a lot of processed sugars, including a lot of fructose. So it's going to induce insulin resistance. It also has a medium amount of saturated fat, and even probably worse, processed oils. So trans fats and margarines and these sorts of soy oil and canola oil and these other like highly processed oils that aren't just pressed from the olive and on your plate, or right from a fish, or right from a cow, or right from a pig. And so you get this entire pattern of bad eating habits, and it's not surprising that a lot of the people who eat that diet get the exact same looking lipid panel because they're all eating the same crap. But my problem with the whole LDL hypothesis of heart disease is that you can also get people who eat tons of, Gary Taubes actually posted his blood panel yesterday, and he said he eats eggs, sausage, and cheese for breakfast, and like a pound of meat for dinner, and like just eats all he eats is meat. He like has convinced himself that this is the healthiest diet, and so that's what he does. His LDL was a little bit high, but his triglycerides were so low, and his HDL was very high, and by most measures I've seen, those are much better indicators of heart disease, of lack of heart disease, of protection against heart disease, than LDL cholesterol. So I don't know. It seems like we don't really have the smoking gun against meat and cholesterol that I've, in my opinion. So I'd love to know what you guys think. Actually, I was going to ask you to do a Summer Tomato live show on the different kinds of fat. Yeah. The monounsaturated versus polyunsaturated fatty acids, it's complicated. I could do that one day. For sure, get into that whole dealio, but in the meantime, I wouldn't. So, okay. One of the other caveats I wanted to point out is in this discussion that we're having about saturated fat and heart disease, it's important to remember that saturated fat has been implicated in a few other diseases, including colon cancer and breast cancer, and so we're not talking about those here. I personally think the data for those things isn't particularly strong either. Maybe colon cancer, that might be one, but again, it could just be a symptom of the Western diet, and people who have these high fat diets also have high sugar and high processed grains and processed fats in their diet. So I'm still lukewarm on those things, but I just want to point that out, that we're only talking about one disease here, and while heart disease is very important, it's not the only disease. And that's another thing that frequently bothers me about studies that come out, because they're like, they'll come out with some piece of data that is usually not conclusive, but they'll say it's conclusive, like, oh, hot dogs are healthy now because, they have this one thing that may reduce this one biomarker of heart disease. Well, the problem is, like, that doesn't mean they don't cause cancer or give you diabetes or give you acne or any, you know what I mean? It's like they tend to be very myopic and focus on one disease. And if you don't have that one disease, and suddenly you're healthy, even though that same substance could give you like 10 different diseases that they just didn't bother to think about to write that article. So I think that's really important to remember. So this discussion that came out from these scientists was only about saturated fat and heart disease. So that's it. I think that's all I wanted to say. We have about 15 minutes or so to take questions if you guys have any, or thoughts. I'd love to hear your thoughts on all this. Who's in here, by the way? I can call you out. Yeah, just a bunch of people watching. Spectators. Come on in, guys. Ask questions. So, if we're just... So that was all I wanted to say for office hours. So you guys are welcome to ask questions, but I have a few more minutes, so I'm just going to keep talking. A couple things that I wanted to point out. One is I found my good camera. Woohoo! So I finally found my decent webcam that's been missing since I moved in September. And so if you're wondering why the picture looks better, that's why. Also, for subscribers, my dad keeps telling me that I need to have Toaster in the videos more. And I'm curious what you guys think about that. For those of you who don't know, Toaster's my puppy. He tends to not be very amused by these little sessions, though. He's just sort of pouting over in the corner. And for those of you who haven't been to this before, haven't been to one of my live events before, so normally I host a show called Summer Tomato Live, and we vote up a topic, and then I put together a little presentation on it and answer questions and sort of take feedback and all that. And we do that every other week. And it's also a newsletter, like a subscription newsletter that's for, where I'll answer any question you have. Like if you have a personal health, nutrition question, like you just can't figure out what to feed your kids for lunch or whatever, like you can email me at any time. I'll answer it. Like it's almost like you have a personal nutritionist. And it's a subscription newsletter called Tomato Slice, and it's $3.99 a month. So if you're interested in signing up for that, it is at tinyletter.com/summertomato, which is the URL at the bottom of the screen. And it looks like we're getting a question here. You mentioned sausage is considered a processed meat. How is sausage, real artisan sausage, any more processed than a pork chop once it reaches the stomach? Isn't it just ground pork? So, yeah. I mean, if it is just ground pork, it's just ground pork. I totally agree with that. It's just sometimes they're cured or, like dried salamis can be, have chemicals that were added to make that. But yeah, I mean, if you're like grinding your own sausage at home, or, your butcher and they're grinding up some pork and maybe a little milk and some herbs and some garlic or something, yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about that. That's probably fine. I mean, you might ask what they use as a casing even, but I mean, don't get me wrong, I eat this stuff all the time. So, but yeah, I always get the fancy stuff. I get the nice, and I think that's good. And people, people often say, well, you're being very elitist. We don't all have access to that good stuff, or we can't afford it. And it's like, I understand. I really can't afford it either, which is kind of good. Like, you shouldn't just be eating meat recklessly like it's free just because our government subsidizes it in massive quantities. I mean, internet bills and TV bills are very expensive, and then, people get very upset about their food bill. And, I understand, but at the same time, you don't need sausage to live, You don't need, like, steak every night, Instead of having steak 6 days a week, like, have it 1 day a week and just get the grass-fed one. So that would be my position on that. I just, when I was a grad student in San Francisco making, like, almost, like, negative money, it was painful. And, that's what I did. I just saved up for the good stuff, and the rest of the time I ate delicious vegetables and beans, and etc. Any more questions? I like that processed meat question. I'm curious, did you guys like Gary's article? What did you think about it? A lot of people, like, most of the comments I got were sort of, this is ridiculous. How could fructose be bad for you? But were you guys intrigued by it? I mean, presumably you were if you're logged in here. You loved it? Okay, cool. Yeah, that's sent it to family, so that's a great point. Fear. Yeah, a lot of people express fear. I heard people on Twitter refer to it as sobering. Yeah, I know. We shouldn't be afraid. That's a great point. So you don't need to be afraid of sugar. You just need to not eat so much of it, right? Yeah, and sending stuff like that to family, it's so hard because, I have friends who I care about, and I have family who I care about deeply, and, they're always like, oh yeah, my cholesterol's a little high, I should, so I don't eat egg yolks, and, shrimp has a lot of cholesterol. I'm like, the last thing you should be doing is, like, throwing away your egg yolks and not eating shrimp. That's like, it's seriously, but it's like, you tell people that, or even if you try to say it in nice ways, it's really tough because they just don't believe you. Because, I don't know. Let's see, they can work on controlling what goes into the body. Yeah, exactly. I have a post that I'm working on for this week, for Wednesday publication, and it talks about this is a really interesting point for me, the distinction between real danger and where that line is. I talked about this during the show, but health isn't a destination, right? It's like a direction that you go. It's a pattern that you live. It's not, you can have health, but it's not like somebody can come over and give it to you. It's something that is reflective of how you've been spending your time, for the past several years. So, when you start talking about sugar being evil, it's like, well, there's a lot of reasons a cupcake isn't evil. Like, a cupcake is a present, a cupcake is love, a cupcake is a lot of things that are tasty and fun, and, they bring people together, and these are all good things. And if one cupcake isn't going to kill you, you really have to get good at judging for yourself what you can tolerate and knowing everything else that you're eating in the context of that cupcake. Because a cupcake alone doesn't mean that much. What really matters is the rest of the diet around the cupcake. Okay, a question from Matt. What are my views on success of rural French diets? High in rich foods, but really low rates of heart disease and much longer lives. I think that's what we've been talking about here. So when you say rich food, you almost always mean fatty. So they use a lot of cream, they use a lot of cheese, they use a lot of pork and game animals, but they also use a lot of olive oil. They also eat a lot of vegetables. They also eat a lot of fish. and, you know, get more exercise than we do, drink more water, drink more wine, don't drink any soda, get more sunshine. That is exactly what we're talking about here. Like, that's why, stuff like that is exactly the reasons why I don't think you can just say saturated fat, that kills you, when it's so obvious that it's like everything in your diet that has to be taken into consideration. So yeah, maybe saturated fat will kill you if you've already had 90 pounds of sugar this year. It's never about just one thing. That's exactly right. You're trying to merge the student health style with these classic French Italian cooking styles. That's awesome. That's awesome. And at the same time, overlook numbers, stats, and chemistry. Yeah, I think that's the best. That's the best tactic. So, the biggest sort of fights people always want to get in with me is, people ask me all the time, why don't you post the calorie information on your recipes? Why don't you give us the nutrition information? It's like, I did give you the nutrition information. It's called the ingredients. Like, go read the ingredients and make a healthy dish. If there's something in there you don't like, that's fine. But I don't count calories. I don't count protein grams. I don't count fat or cholesterol. I don't even think about those things. What I think about is, how much sugar is in here, because that's a processed food. I ask if there's grains in here, how processed are they? And, in terms of heavy meats, because I will actually gain weight if I eat too much meat. Like, it's just so many calories. So I will ask, how much meat have I had this week? And I'll try to keep it down to 2 or 3 red meat style dishes, because more than that, and I just start getting sick, and I literally get nauseous if I eat too much meat too many days in a row. I know some people can do it; they can eat tons of it. I just am not one of those people, and like I said, I gain weight when I do that. So it's not for everyone. It works for me. And these are sort of, but I always think in terms of whole foods. I never think in terms of nutrients. And when I go to the store and I look at ingredients, that's what I'm looking for. When I check the nutrition label, I'm not like, oh, I don't know, there's 850 milligrams of sodium in here. I always only look at the ingredients. And if it's sodium nitrate, sodium, salt, blah, 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 and those are the first ingredients, I'm like, okay, this is clearly junk food. And if it's refined cornstarch and blah, 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 and, you can tell by the ingredients. You shouldn't need to be confused by the nutrition labels. And I honestly don't worry that much about calories either. I never count my olive oil, tablespoons. I never question whether or not I should add nuts to a dish if I want it. I eat cheese. I don't buy a lot of cheese because cheese is expensive, mainly is the main reason, but I do love it, and I buy it occasionally for a snack or for, a special recipe that calls for Parmesan or something good. But when I stopped worrying about all those other things, I lost 10 pounds. Let's put it that way. I think I just realized that I'm always turn red during these videos because these lights are 1,000 degrees, burning my face. Anyway, so that was fun. Anybody else? Oh, here's a question. Can I describe more about the Chiyoga beets you got at the farmer's market this week? Oh, heck yeah. This is my favorite kind of question ever. I will, let me see, actually. Hold on. I'll give you a link. So Chiyoga beets are awesome because if you look at them from the outside, they are pink. So not the bright, dark red ones that you normally get that turn your fingers red and make your pee red and stuff like that. The Chiyoga beets, they're a lighter, paler pink color. And what's awesome is when you peel and chop them up. Here's a picture right there. Here, I'm going to scroll that up so that people can see on the recording. Those are Chiyoga beets. There they are. But basically, they're striped. They're red and they're pink and white striped, and they're so cool to look at. Their flavor is a little milder than like the hardcore red beets. So if the flavor of those bright red beets is a little much for you and you sort of want to ease your way into more gentle beets, these are a great way to start. They're beautiful. They don't turn everything red, and they're delicious. So that recipe that I just pointed to is probably what I'm going to make. It's so good. So good. Yeah. The farro, roasted beets and farro with some dill and like a vinaigrette and like a little shallot. Oh, so good. I'm really worried now that I like moved my screen all over the place, and I worry that the recording is going to be like totally off center, and I'm not even going to be in the picture anymore. Say love you. All right, so I think we're just about ready to wrap it up. Yeah, they're striped. Aren't they beautiful? Right. That's the cool thing about buying stuff at the farmer's market when you don't know what it is. Like you get it home and it's like it looks like peppermint swirl, right? Those beets, they're so pretty. I love it. All right, you guys are awesome. Thank you, Virginia. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, everybody else who is here and helping out. And I appreciate your time and energy. All right, I'm going to take off. Thanks, guys.